Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. It's going to be a wonderful conversation, and I'm joined by a very special guest. I'm joined by Jeremy Carl, who is a senior editor at the Claremont Institute. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be on.
Well, thank you. So, for those of in my audience who don't know who you are, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, some of the work that you've done, and why we're here today discussing your recent article.
Sure. So as you mentioned, my name is Jeremy Carl. I'm a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. We are based out of California, a public policy think tank, although that's not maybe always the cleanest way to describe what we do. There's actually today, just coincidentally, the New York Times dropped a huge 7,500 word feature on us. And for those of you who subscribe to the failing New York Times or have other access, I actually amazingly would encourage you to read it. It's actually unbelievably rather fair-minded in terms of what we do. But we're really about kind of the philosophy of the American founding and kind of the celebration of the values of that and what we can do to kind of restore those principles in our current public life. So that's what I sort of do today. Before this, I served in the Trump administration. I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Interior there. It's kind of a whole separate public policy life I have, an environment resource policy that I've spent a lot of time in. But prior to that, I spent a decade at the Hoover Institution, which is a sort of more establishment-oriented, if you will, public policy think tank at Stanford University. And was very involved with a variety of public policy issues there, immigration, nationalism, a lot of things that are kind of core to my interest today. And then, as part of that, I've just participated in general in a lot of the broader kind of debates around in the online right and, what some would call the dissident right or the new right, depending on kind of who you are. And as part of that, I've actually known Curtis at least online since the earliest days. Curtis Yarvin of his original blog on qualified reservations, and then when I was living in the Bay Area at the time at Stanford, got to know him a little bit in person, and have sort of appreciated, but also had some critiques of his work over time. And just as part of a recent piece he did, just decided to sort of make a little bit of that argument public, because I think it sort of serves a public interest in terms of how we think about things on the right.
Yep, and that's exactly why we're here. So I'm pretty sure my audience knows quite well that Curtis had recently wrote last month on the 10th. You can only lose the culture war, which we sort of had an interesting Tolkien analogy about hobbits and elves, which he's now later elaborated on. But the core principle about it, and which you had outlined, I thought rather well in your piece that you had provided in response, is that essentially resistance to the regime by commoners is hopeless because elites play by different rules. And what is good for the few will not work for the many. And there is reason for the right to fight on the regime's field because the regime sets the rules and ensures that it always wins. And you called it quietism, sort of this response I think that Curtis has been talking about a lot, which he's labeled as being clear pilled, or that there are other ways of fighting by not fighting at all. He talks about that in the piece about the
Yeah.
need for strategy, not action.
Sure. And, Curtis sort of claims to be a quietist at many times. And I think, like all really significant kind of thinkers, you need to sometimes read Curtis esoterically. So even as somebody who knows Curtis, reasonably well and considers him something of a friend, I'm not sure how much he actually subscribes to quietism versus finding quietism in the way that Leo Strauss often did when he wrote about Leo Strauss being a huge influence on Claremont, where it's in Persecution in the Art of Writing, the necessity for a philosopher to kind of guide and kind of often mask his or her true intentions, so they don't kind of run afoul of the regime that may be hostile to philosophy. I think a little bit of that may be going on with Curtis and some of the quietism that he has, but I think it's out there so much that for the average reader, I think, and the average reader of Curtis is already pretty smart and informed, but I think they're probably taking what he says pretty literally. And I do think there's a sort of danger in embracing that type of inaction too much.
Yeah, and I one of the things that I noticed in the initial reactions to it were, of course, sort of the visceral vitriol, as he mentions in his later sort of piece expounding on it, that people are mad. And then the second one, however, was a defense brought up by Lomez that you had mentioned in your piece. That Lomez had went on a rather long Twitter thread about it, sort of discussing that this application of the analogy I think is misplaced because his audience, of course, are going to be more well informed, are going to be politically connected individuals like yourself, and that this isn't really directed at the hobbits. It's more directed towards the elves, which I think is
Right.
interesting because he's more or less chastising, I think, more so political organizers in sort of this kind of condescending way,
Right.
at least in my like read through, because it's basically saying, listen, the regime will play by different rules. And he's talked about this before when criticizing Chris Rufo,
Right.
where it's great to ban CRT, but they can still manipulate it to get what they want regardless, right? And I
Right.
think we're seeing that now out of Dobbs too.
Right. And there are elements of this, by the way, that are true. And I think you're absolutely correct in your summary of I think his thinking about this. I mean, and I think one of the values for me of reading Curtis over the years is he's definitely gotten me to think maybe more radically, and but I mean that literally in the kind of genealogy of radicalism, which means to go to the root of some of these issues, and certainly that you can have these smaller tactical victories or even significant tactical victories that ultimately end up being strategic defeats. Um, so I think it's important that we do think of that. At the same time, I don't share kind of his view that they're all defeats. And a guy like Chris, who has interacted, with Curtis, and today, if you there was a the New York Times dropped a considerably less fair-minded piece on Blake Masters, who just won the Arizona Senate primary for the GOP, and has a very good chance of being elected to the Senate. But as part of this profile, they mentioned that Blake quotes Curtis a fair bit, even on the campaign trail. Um, and obviously, Blake doesn't kind of share that quietist view of things, or he wouldn't be out there doing what he's doing. What I do think you can take away from it that does make sense is that you need to be muscular. You need to not be afraid to be bold. To not be afraid to move very decisively in terms of what you do, and be willing to kind of break a little bit of China uh, here and there. But not that we should sort of retreat from the battlefield entirely, and that our kind of opponents are just so powerful that we don't have any real chance of kind of defeating them. And so that's where I kind of do take some exception, and I think it's kind of important. And again, as you point out, he's not talking to the folks who just want to sit in the backyard and grill. I mean, that's what he calls the hobbits. I mean, he's talking to folks who are participants. Many of us do have access through various ways. Through various elite institutions. I myself spent 20 years at Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, in addition to the political stuff I did. And so, to kind of tell that audience to kind of, just shut up and give up, I think can be counterproductive.
Yeah, and I find it also that because the internet is not the internet of unqualified reservations or even his earlier Usenet days, right? These ideas are easily accessible to where, middle of nowhere hobbits like myself can easily like read them and, take issue with the fact that that is the case. And I do think that sometimes it takes a bit of breaking that cognitive dissonance of knowing that a lot of people do want to be left alone. And I think that mindset is beginning to change. I mean, I think a mutual friend of ours, Oren McIntyre, has been very adamant about that on Twitter, that the side that wants to be left alone is inevitably the side that loses, because other people will definitely want to win and do things to the others. But uh, I think the thing that has also kind of come up in a lot of sort of these discussions over his work is he does wield influence. He's as a friend of mine said, he's minted, right? He's not going anywhere. Which, for better or for worse, he's the political philosopher of our times. And there's this concern about, sort of to use this Hobbit elf analogy, there's this concern about trust. I think with dark elves, that he talks about people that are in there. The reason why I think people might have a positive view of Blake Masters more than say Curtis Yarvin in his writings, despite Blake Masters quoting him, is that Blake Masters is sort of vocally supportive of those that do want to be left alone, or of the Grill American, where
Yeah.
these ideas, right? I guess there's some tone that comes with it. One, not to tone police, because I think that can sometimes be terrible, but
Yeah.
it's definitely something that's out there, because the thing that always has rubbed me wrong with sort of that idea has been, who do I trust, right? Like, if I'm to be engaged in the political system, where is my trust going to lie? Because one of the objections that I think a lot of more Christian side of the right has been concerned about is that you want someone who shares a similar teleology to you. And it's sometimes a little hard to see where that might be going when, like he says, it should be secretive. We shouldn't know about it. And so some of us are left in the dark and a bit concerned.
No, and I think that's absolutely right. And I say that myself. I'm a Christian convert, and I think that that element of kind of belief and telos at the end is pretty fundamental if you're a Christian to how you think about the world, and that kind of gets a little bit left aside in Curtis's critique. I mean, Curtis is not a Christian; he doesn't claim to be a Christian. Um, uh, so I think that's a significant element, especially because a significant number of the conservative hobbits, to kind of use his terminology, I think are Christians of one stripe or another. And I think this issue of trust that you raise is a very important one. And there are issues. I mean, I now live in Montana myself. I am in the land of the hobbits. I mean, certainly very far away from the kind of centers of power in the United States, and that was a very intentional decision by myself, on the part of myself and my family, that we wanted to get away from that and essentially to be left alone and just grill, right? I mean, to an extent. Now I'm trying to participate in local and state politics in various ways, so that I don't think that we can just sort of run away forever, nor should that be our stance. But at times, and maybe this is actually a little bit more of a kind of Curtis Yarvin friendly tactical approach. I mean, I just viewed as like, well, the Bay Area, which is where I'd been for many years when I was at Stanford, is just not savable. It's not defensible territory, to use military terms. So we're retreating to a tactically defensible territory here in Montana, where there are like-minded people. Where, not to be too provocative, but we have the highest gun ownership rate in the country. It's generally a very conservative state. And there are a lot of people who don't particularly agree with the way that the kind of cathedral, as Curtis has classified it, is running things, and are happy to kind of push back aggressively against that. And so, again, I think that while wanting to be left alone is probably not sufficient in the way that Oren has kind of outlined, I do think that it's fine to kind of retreat, to make a tactical retreat, so that you can regroup your forces for a counterattack. Again, I think that people who are just hanging out in an elite milieu, and I think Curtis is increasingly in that world. There are questions of trust with the audience, and I think that you're right also that some of the pushback um, on Curtis's original piece was a little bit of the tone of that piece, in terms of how he was talking to his audience in a way that maybe some people didn't kind of feel like they were being fully respected.
Yeah, and the other thing that I had noticed in there, and this is something that I've sort of noticed as this new right, quote unquote, has gotten more attention, is that his idea of the culture war, I think, also kind of plays into that sort of elite Bay Area, New York City, London style of culture war, where perhaps these ideas in the ether are a little more transgressive, and that there is some appeal to doing so, where he's talking about in the original, you can only lose the culture war. I mean, he talks about it meaning, I'll bring it up on screen so our audience can see it. He talks about the importance of establishing cultural dominance. Yeah, to make dissident ideas more fashionable, it is not necessary to water them down, just the opposite. It is necessary to make them more daring, more frightening, beautiful and audacious and transgressive, and more surprising than delightful. is to seduce these high elves into losing their faith in their own prestigious institutions. And to me, sure, but my thing is just how many poetry readings in some bar in New York City is going to do that. But this also comes from my own perspective of not knowing what goes on behind the scenes, because I'm not in any sort of in crowd here. But
Right.
this hidden cadre of dark elves who emerge from the future, you would want that culture, I guess, to do things in other ways. I do agree with. I think that I am 1776 is a good avenue for this. I think that other artists like Alexander Adams has proposed having an art institute for sort of more high-minded, high culture for dissident art. But I do think that, yeah, it's great to have sort of a transgressive culture that seems alluring, but not to be too crass. But politics is kink can only get you so far, and I do think that there should be a little more on the organization side. I think there needs to be maybe perhaps more Chris Rufos and less poetry readings.
No, and that's exactly right. And I think one of the things that if there's anything almost I firmly believe in terms of politics and how one engages in politics, is that there are all sorts of different players in a coalition, especially where we are today, where we have essentially two parties in the United States. Although you could argue, of course, that there are different parties within those parties. But in doing that, to exercise power, you need all sorts of different people operating in all sorts of different spaces to kind of move the ball forward. And I talk about a little bit in my piece about the Dobbs decision, about how this was really, to use even Curtis's own parlance, I mean, it was a combination of some very smart dark elves working very elite ways, along with an army of hobbits that were out there in streets and in clinics protesting and doing these things. And I think when we look more broadly at politics, you absolutely need. I mean, Chris Rufo has just been, I think, sensationally effective, and I don't think like just toward tactical defeat, but toward tactical actual victory, especially on things like the trans issue, where I just think there's no way for the left to really square that circle over time. And the more they try, the weaker that particular idol looks. But similarly with schools, and I think that I'm a parent of 5 children myself, and so I think this kind of really speaks very directly to kids, and that's kind of how Chris got out there. So we need Chris's out there, we need grassroots organizers, and we need Curtis's to, yes, be doing poetry readings and convincing folks in Greenwich Village and who write for the New York Times that in fact maybe what's here is a little more enticing, cool, and transgressive than the very lame, very establishment stuff that they are engaged with right now. I do think that these are all important pieces. I just don't like it when one part of a coalition kind of is knocking the other part, even though they all do it. I mean, people on our side and my part do this all the time. I hate purity spirals. I am very much a 50 plus 1% person. Not that I think, unfortunately, that kind of democratic vote is sufficient, but it's often necessary to get done a lot of the things that you want to get done. And I have a much more expansive view of politics as something that ultimately is an elite practice in many ways, but that you need everybody to be participating in ultimately to really move the ball forward in the way that you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I do online political commentary as a side gig. I know all about infighting and and purity spiraling. It's definitely not a good time. I can only imagine when there's real, things at stake that are definitely going to be of consequence for it, and it makes it awful. But one of the things, though, that I think that he had sort of talked about when a victory can be a defeat, and I think that this is where I mentioned his sort of criticism of Rufo. I think has sort of stood very well. Is that since the Dobbs decision, I've noticed two major things that have sort of shown that some of these victories can be large in part political release valves, where there's sort of this is a fantastic moral victory. This is great. We can rest on our laurels. Not that it ever ends up like that. Or not that it is intended to view it that way, but it sometimes does. Where since Dobbs, the DOJ has decided to go after Idaho with its fetal protection law, basically banning abortion after 6 weeks. And the Merrick Garland has decided to investigate and sue them because it violates some sort of federal law in regards to the life of the mother. And then the second one was, of course, the constitutional referendum inside of Kansas, which
Yeah.
I didn't see too much political attention being given by a lot of mainstream commentators, and unfortunately, that lost.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting, and this is, I spent a fair bit of my own piece kind of talking about Dobbs in particular, because that it sort of was, I thought, a particular objection I had to Curtis, perhaps because there was a grain of truth there, but I didn't think it was developed one enough. I think you have to separate um, two different things. One is we have had fake abortion politics on the right for so long. And we have a lot of fake politics on the right in general. We're so used to losing that we do a bunch of very symbolic stuff that doesn't actually ever move anything or become a law or whatever else, but it allows us to posture. In the Roe versus Wade world, we did this a lot with abortion, where, well, I'm going to turn my abortion restrictions up to 11. And I want to leave aside, with reservation, kind of some of the broader ethical and moral issues around abortion, which I think are quite significant. And I myself consider myself pro-life, certainly. And just talk about it from a political perspective, which is, in America today, there is a great, when you look at opinion polls, which are very deceptive because the Democrats love to ask about Roe v. Wade, and people don't actually know what's in Roe v. Wade or what it does. And that makes it look like overturning it is more unpopular. But there are a lot of restrictions that are quite popular, that were illegal under Roe v. Wade, that can be kind of put into law now. And so that is a victory. But the problem is, the GOP has gone so far in terms of, in some places, well, there's no risk, no abortion under any circumstances, even with rape or incest, or that we're going to say that should be illegal, separate from whether that's a moral position. I certainly understand, and I have many people in my church who would take that view. That's not a majority view, or even anything close to it, of people in America today. So to the extent that overturning Dobbs becomes a vehicle for us to do a bunch of fake politics, or to kind of try to put into real world a lot of our fake abortion politics in the past, yes, it will lead to defeats, and perhaps significant defeats, even like we had in Kansas, because Kansas, we put what looked like it was sort of opaque, but there was kind of a maximalist version of abortion restriction potentially in there. So we lose, but that's a very separate question from whether overturning Roe v. Wade and showing that we could do that, and then circumscribing in some significant ways the practice of abortion, and understanding that now we can open up an entire dialogue and begin to move over time in various states toward a more and more pro-life position. That is real politics. But unfortunately, I think we, as a practical matter, have overshot. But that doesn't mean that I accept Curtis's view, which is like, oh, well, elf bodies can't be touched by hobbits or ruled by hobbits in any way. Kind of this sort of devolves into abortion up to 40 weeks, which is what the Democrats, or at least some of them, have sort of been pushing, is okay. I don't think that's a winning position for them either. So I think the practical politics of how abortion plays out are still to be determined, but I think you have to distinguish that in a meaningful way from what it means to kind of overturn this idol that the Democrats have had for a long time, and say that, yes, we can smash it, and we are still going to be politically viable in smashing it, and we are going to make this issue back on the table, and one that is subject to political debate, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, my viewpoint from the Dobbs decision was that while it's a great moral victory, and it certainly is in regards to the politics of Roe v. Wade for 50 years, is that it should have been viewed, I think, with very cautious optimism, because, like you had mentioned, a lot of the abortion politics of Roe v. Wade that had felt untouchable for 50 years, especially after Casey versus Planned Parenthood in the 90s, has just been, well, we can always use it as a rallying cry, in the same way that we can use tax cuts, military spending, and,
Yeah.
closing the border to be that. And then when someone comes around and where they start talking about it in real terms, whether that be Trump, whether that be Steve Bannon, whether that be Blake Masters, then of course, right, that's when, oh, this isn't just kayfabe, as the term likes to be used, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And that's something that I think that has noticed, where I do think that, yeah, the culture war is an important thing to fight, because yeah, okay, great, Dobbs means that abortion is going to now be regulated back to the states. This doesn't undo, the 60 plus years of a sexual revolution that has fundamentally wrecked families and how we develop and how we view relationships, which I think has done just worse things in regards to the culture than quite a few other of the right wing sort of nitpicks on culture. I mean, the sexual revolution can't be understated, and I think that would have been a great way to sort of springboard that. Maybe it can be, because there are other issues that need to be addressed, and I think that's how you take sort of these moral idol victories of idol smashing and start looking at the pieces and seeing the reactions and how to go from there. I do think that, of course, the culture war is necessary, but and you have to fight it. You have to, because that's where your way of life comes from.
Sure.
Like we talked about at the beginning with our teleology and such. Like, all of those things come from your culture, how you express it, and how you practice. And so, yeah, it might be seen as potentially a loss now, but I think that, as you had mentioned and how you had written, that there are avenues to actually meaningfully and pragmatically proceed.
Sure, and with this particular issue, and this is just about the only time you'll ever hear me quote George W. Bush favorably, even though I think when he was doing it, it was largely fake. I think this gets us to a point where we can begin on this particular issue talking about a culture of life, and that that kind of impinges. It gets into some of the broader issues around the sexual revolution that you touched on, and some of these other things. But without this legal victory, we couldn't even get there. To even, it wouldn't matter whether we had one, because there was still just abortion on demand effectively everywhere. um, Now we can begin the hard work of convincing people, but as you mentioned, it's really, this was a first step, and it should have been greeted with cautious optimism. I mean, obviously it was a great thing that it happened, um, but over the short term, some of our fakery has been exposed, and that is a problem for us. And then it also uh, it doesn't obviate the need for us to kind of really do the work, to use a famous left wing expression, over time, to kind of make a change. But again, that's not to say that we shouldn't do it. I mean, we don't. Curtis effectively seems to sometimes argue that you sort of win by losing, and I would argue, no, you win by winning. And that doesn't mean that it's always easy, to get the next win, but certainly, that to get a win is a very valuable thing, even if it effectively just forces your enemy to expose its forces, to kind of show where they are, to sort of reveal their powers, that they would prefer to have hidden.
Yeah, I was about to say that one of the more recent pieces I've seen come out was out of Axios in regards to whether or not Trump wanted to bring back that Schedule F.
Yeah.
They went nuts over that, and to me, that's the real. Even though Trump had witnessed fortification in 2020, I'll leave it at that to be safe on YouTube. That the real victory out of that, the silver lining, I would say, not a victory, is that they just sort of went unmasked about it. They had the whole Times Magazine article about it. They've talked about how well connected everything is. It was sort of this, he talks about draining the swamp, and I think he meant a lot of that rhetorically and sort of that getaway go and win for the 2016 election. But I mean, the big silver lining of the Trump administration is this: that you have all of the civil service, all of the press, all of the media, all of any sort of judicial activism is against you. And so, like, you've really had the first time, I think, since Richard Nixon, a full scale and scope of what your enemy looks like, at least in a large, vague, silhouetted outline.
And that was interesting that you mentioned that, because I think under Nixon we were aware, but we didn't have any of the tools, like the online tools, like the ability to push back against the mainstream media, that we have today. And so we kind of saw it, but we couldn't do anything about it. It really was more of a kind of classic Yarvin-esque situation in that case, where our enemy really was, very powerful. I mean, there are these subversive books that have kind of been lost to history that you can read from that time. There's a book called "It Didn't Start with Watergate." That's kind of this early, very revisionist history of Watergate that effectively treats it as a deep state coup. Um, but the cultural power of books like that, was so small as compared to like what the three networks and the New York Times and everybody else could manufacture at that time in terms of manufacturing consent, that we were sort of helpless. I think that's no longer the case. With respect to Schedule F, you touched on that. I was in the administration when that was released, and my first thing, I went and talked to folks who'd been working in personnel, was like, where was this 3 years ago? I mean, this was great, right? Like, and there was all sorts of reasons. I mean, they really did have this, unfortunately, early in the administration and did not go through with it. I think when people read the Axios piece, and just for your listeners here who may not know, the Schedule F was basically a way for us to be able to remove kind of very senior civil servants who were kind of actively thwarting the government, which is frankly, it's contrary to their supposed role in the system where they're supposed to serve elected officials. I can tell you, as somebody who was supervising 10,000 people at the Department of the Interior, that I did not always have the undiminished love, affection, and let's go move in this direction together of everybody on my staff who was supposed to be working for me and my boss as delegated authority from the president. So Schedule F was a way of saying, hey, you know what, we're gonna retake democratic control of the government in a way that was constitutional and would sort of restore constitutional governance to the U.S. That I think we probably haven't really had, certainly from the right, in quite a long time, because we just haven't been able to have that authority. I think when people read the Axios piece that touched on Schedule F, I think I and a lot of my friends, I mean, I'm sure the left was like up in arms and angry. I was like, boy, big if true. I would love to see it, right? Like, I'm a little bit skeptical. There were some wonderful people there in presidential personnel, particularly at the end of the administration, and some really good people in the administration who I think really are willing to kind of push the ball forward in some very meaningful ways if we get a second bite at the apple. But whether kind of the swamp folks or the hangers on or these other folks will just kind of diminish that energy, I think is something that we're really concerned about. And so the way in which the left and right reacted in very different ways to that piece, I think was kind of instructive.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll shill Oren once more. We did talk about Schedule F over on his channel to talk about what that meant and the people involved, because there are quite a few names that we were familiar with. I mean, Andrew Kloster being one of them that Oren's talked with, and I've spoken
Great
to.
guy,
So,
really
yeah,
good guy.
he's a good guy, and to me that talks to me more so about the dark elf analogy that Yarvin puts out is that these guys are clearly not your run of the mill, has a normal job or works a truck or whatever. The guys that just want to grill, the grill Americans, as plenty like to call them. And to me, that seems like you're the viable counter elite that you can work with, because I think that for a lot of online criticism that may be levied against, say, the Claremont, Hillsdale, the Hoover Institution, or the what was it, like the Center for American Renewal, the one that I think they're working on now with the Trump administration, that article, like they're viable to me. I'm sometimes very skeptical of entryism just because I've worked like on the local level, and you're like, oh, this is who you're working with.
Right.
But I see why they're using it, because that is a place where is both Yarvin and I think that you've also put, like, those are a place that you can recruit almost en masse the necessary counter elite that you would need.
Sure. And I've written about, I wrote a piece in the American Conservative a couple months back. I think it was called Toward a Republican Counter Elite, if you just type that in with my name. And it actually got quite a lot of attention, positive attention on our side, because it was really an attempt to grasp and grapple with, like, well, what does that look like? And it's sort of a proto-Yarvinist argument in that it really does say, politics is elite politics at a certain level, and that we need to pay attention to that. And be really serious about cultivating the elite. But I think it's a very open question as to where you cultivate that elite from. And my view, and I put this in my own piece that we're talking about today, was that honestly, our current quote unquote elite is not really all that elite, other than they happen to have power. And so definitionally, they're elite, but they're kind of neurotic and crazy and not nearly as smart as they used to be. And that there's a lot of people out there in the dissident space who are really quite smart and talented, who are, maybe they're by the Red River in Texas, maybe they're in Montana, maybe they're in Iowa, wherever have you. Or maybe they're in DC, but they're just on the outs because they are not playing the game, that I think can be marshaled into this project. I think we can also look at from this counter elite. One thing I sort of focused on as a hunting ground for this, and certainly you see a lot of these folks on the new right, is white men are really the whipping boy of the new regime in so many ways. I mean, kind of overtly and covertly the subject of discrimination, but yet white guys still have a lot of power in our society. And I actually have a childhood friend who was recently nominated as a federal judge by Biden, and I think out of 85 or whatever he's got federal judge nominees, there's like 4 white guys. Okay, and you had to have a really extraordinary resume like my friend did to be even vaguely viable for that. And so I think there are these disaffected groups. I mean, also I think increasingly Asian Americans. They're going to be groups that are groups where there's a lot of talented folks who are not being served by the current regime. The regime is not serving their interests, and we should be cultivating an elite from those groups. And again, I think there's a lot of people out there like that, and that's why I kind of push back against a kind of politics of despair or quietism, because I think this is a real force that can be harnessed.
Yeah, and I think that as the water heat, as the frog slowly gets to boil a little more, I think that there's going to be a lot more attention on those disaffected individuals that I think will be an avenue to do so. There's a blogger by the name of Spandrel who talked about this. He called it the base draft, right? Maybe you've
Yeah,
heard of it. Where
I know
so
Spandrel.
so there
Really,
you go.
I haven't read him in a while, and I really should. I read him
Well,
quite a bit a while back.
he's just on Urbit now, so it's just like I need to go make that transition to go see what he's writing these days. But yeah, no, I think that'll be plenty more in practice, especially in recent. And I think that Ron DeSantis has done a very excellent job of that. I mean, he basically drafted all when he said like all the police officers in New York that decided not to go under that mandate, then you can come and work for us, right? Like I think it does show some viability of harvesting our own diamonds in the rough, because I'm sure that there are plenty of guys in there that they want their job and they want to maintain it, right, because they have family and kids to feed, but at the same time, right, they're constantly being not put up for promotion and doing so. So I do think that there's an avenue for perhaps a not as quiet politics, and I think that that's something that would, I think, do a lot of help in perhaps understanding where both Curtis is coming from and maybe where these institutions are coming from, because the internet makes all this more accessible to read now. And in terms of that practicality, I think that it would be good for us to have our own fostered and people that are like-minded or people that have been shafted by the regime to do so. I'm just looking at both what Curtis wrote on screen and the notes I've got. I do think that he has a point, though, about some sort of split between these elites and getting our own, because it feels very akin geopolitically to like the Sino-Soviet split, how you can pit those two against one another. And I do think that that's a good position to go forward in that direction.
Yeah, I think there's tremendous opportunity to split the elite, and you just have to look at the groups that are again not being treated well by the current regime. You also touched on what DeSantis has done, and he's a classic example. DeSantis has followed me on Twitter for quite a while, so like I've always been he could probably shoot someone in the middle of the street, and I'd still be a fan, right? That's how it works with electeds and writers. But I think one of the useful things about the regime kind of attempting to purge its people of people who object to vax mandates or whatever it is, people who essentially will not go on with their political program, is they've actually helpfully identified a bunch of leaders for us. And when we come back in, we ought to be, especially to the extent those guys have been literally purged, but even to the extent that they've been demoted, we should be unashamedly just saying, hey, guess what? You guys are all in charge now. And by the way, we're going to find the ringleaders of all the people who cooperated with the other guy, and they're now going to be on the outs. And that is just, it's politics. I mean, we need to understand this the regime level struggle, and we need to kind of sort of embrace the folks who are kind of with us in that struggle. And again, because the regime has had to make its power very visible, it's sort of identified some of these people for us because they've had to speak out or they've lost position. And part of any concerted personnel effort I think we have in the next administration should be to take those people who have been overtly put on the outs and make them be on the inside, or if you're at the state level, let's recruit them to your state. All sorts of things like that, I think, can be very effective strategies.
Yeah, I mean, it is good to see more of the establishment embrace a sort of clear them out style strategy where, that has sort of been, again, that silver lining where a lot of people have made it very clear where their allegiances lie, which is a good and easy way to identify them. If there are parts that are quiet, I do think that it would be if power is, say, seized again in 24, which I have some skepticism about, but
through democratic elections, of course.
Well, yeah, of course, through democratic, which all makes me more a little,
Right, makes you more skeptical that it'll actually happen. I'm not that black-pilled. Do not be black-pilled like that. I think we can. I mean, what's the regime going to do that they didn't do against Trump? And you can say, well, that was successful, but I don't think it was really, really marginally successful. And I'm not a person who is so cynical about where we are that I'm like, oh, well, even though if just 45,000 votes had switched in 3 states, Trump would have won, that, if that had happened, they would have just found some other way to move it. No, I think like just a little bit more of a popular Trump and a little bit more of an unpopular Biden, and we're back in the White House. Now, what we do with that's a separate question. Whether we're really ready for that moment, that's a separate question. We'll be a heck of a lot more ready, I think, than we were in 2017. But I want to discourage folks on the right from being so black-pilled as to say, oh, we can't win the election, or again, that we can't participate in the democratic process meaningfully because we'll just always be outmaneuvered. Again, I think, maybe a little bit of this is implicit in some of the things that Curtis suggests, and maybe is at the core of my disagreement with him. It's not that our enemies are not as unscrupulous or bad or kind of even demonic, if I could use maybe a slightly more loaded word than we say they are, but it's that their power is not so great as some fear it is.
Well, it's not that I maybe I'm skeptical on a national level. I still have hope for. That's why I think most of my attention is mainly oriented around the local and the community because I'm not you, right? Like I'm not in that sort of connected space. So that's where I know I can still make the most meaningful impact. And I think that
Sure.
the other thing, right, with another reason why, like on the national level, I'm more than okay with Trump running in 24 is that it keeps DeSantis out. Because I think DeSantis has done more good, not only for the state of Florida, but showing an example to Republican governors across the state, across the country, to actually act in a more meaningful way. So when someone like Ron DeSantis takes some action, then someone like Greg Abbott, who is notoriously flip-floppy on a lot of issues, takes notice and sees how the base reacts to that, which has been good, especially for someone living in Texas. But
go ahead. And I agree that DeSantis has been great because of the force of his example, and that it sort of convinced all of us who said, we're not crazy, that we could actually do a bunch of stuff and win. And in fact, you could even do it in purplish states. You just have to be smart about it. And until we had that kind of very visible example of doing that and winning, it was kind of hard to make that pitch. But now I'm like, well, look, Florida is a very purple state. It's a state that demographically is very representative of where America is going, for better or for worse. And Ron DeSantis is governing conservatively and successfully and in a popular way there. So Again, that's my antidote to blackpilling.
No, well, maybe we do need a little more of that these days, But I wanted to transition real quickly because outside of your article, which is all linked in the description, and I know my chat has read it because they're very good boys and girls. But Yarvin, in his latest piece, did offer to reply, although that reply section was behind the paywall, but you were kind enough to share it with me. And I thought that some of this was particularly interesting, where he's sort of just going through some of the points that you had made and had replied, where he sort of is very, again, more about the procedural outcomes to, get the desired results, where he's talking about, $179 round trip spas to get an abortion. And which, I mean, they've discussed having things on federal land or in international water, which, I mean, how far that'll go, who knows? But I mean, that's the thing with the Dobbs decision is that, the states that already have it enshrined in law are going to keep it. I mean, New York and in California are still going to have it, which, I mean, sure. Which is why I think that it's important to have some sort of, telos in this, right? Where you need to view these things as moral victories for what they are. And I get it. There's the realpolitik that he's getting at, but again, I would like my elites to somewhat share my belief systems and understand how things are going. But one of the things that he had said, and I'll read it out, which was this was the interesting thing here. He says, the whole mentality of generating power by getting power to abuse people is a leftist mentality. Like so many leftist mind tricks, it only works for them, but not us. When people are strong, typically not because of their own strength, but because they are channeling the power of what Carl Schmitt called an interested third party, it works. The people are weak. Being abused makes them weaker. If the hungry people revolted, why didn't the Dutch revolt against the Germans in 1944 or the Germans against the Allies in 1919 or 1945? And this is where he's just sort of talking about the whole kindergarten politics thing, about sort of that intriest, I'm just a Bill Schoolhouse Rock approach. And the thing that I find, he's, again, for those of us who've read various forms of elite theory. Our good friend, Mr. Parvini, has written an excellent book called The Populist Delusion, which does highlight more or less the greatest hits of how elite theory operates, that you do need a tightly organized minority to help control things. But that tightly organized minority, I think, needs to be sharing similar interests. And that interested third party should be guys like you or those in the Axios article that were mentioned, because at least those guys have I think in my position, to have a better grounding of what the situation is a little more on the ground than, a Bay Area blogger that, goes to poetry readings and art shows. Not to denigrate Mr. Yarvin. I've learned a lot from him, and his, the reading list that he's given out over the years is fantastic. But there's some practicality concerns, I think, when it comes to that, where a lot of people will look at him and just immediately disregard, in part because one, tone, two, you're a materialist atheist, and like we're going to clash on some ideas, right? Like that's what's going to happen.
Right. No, I think absolutely, and then definitely having that level of identification with telos and with kind of broader core values is important. And again, I say that I talk at length about the very positive influence that reading Curtis's writing has had on sharpening my thinking, even when I don't agree with him. And in fact, the first time I even wrote him was probably about 12 years ago now. I basically, I think I made a little small in-kind donation to a babysitting fund that he had. He was a much smaller time operator at that point, and I sort of said, "Hey," in the note, I said, "I don't always agree with a lot of your stuff, but I think it's really brilliant and interesting." And so I think you can have that type of appreciation without having full agreement, but at a certain point in politics, having kind of agreement on those bigger fundamentals is important. And Curtis is sort of, he has this type of theory of how power operates, and it's certainly true that just inherently being oppressed doesn't mean that you're going to get a revolt, much less even a successful revolt. In fact, historically, you often find that it's when conditions are improving that the populace begins to get more restive, as they can kind of see an out for them, where maybe when it's just completely darkness, they can't even see a way of changing it. But I would say, and I talk about this in my piece, and I think it's sort of a more fundamental disagreement that Curtis and I have, is that um, you know, this type of behavior where they're, oh, we'll put an abortion clinic on federal land, or we'll do all these things to kind of eliminate your actual, real, fairly won political victory. He sort of assumes that's the last move on the chessboard implicitly. And I just don't. I think we get to move. And I think there's a lot of people who can be real political leaders and elites on our side who they buy into the current system. They would never use the term like regime. To describe our current regime. I mean, they kind of are still kind of trapped in what I would call the normie delusion, even though, and I work with a lot of these folks. A lot of these folks are really good people. I mean, certainly in Montana conservative politics, I think there's, these people here are good people. They just want to grill for the most part. If they wanted to take power, they wouldn't be here. They'd be off in DC or New York or something. And so kind of convincing them about the kind of malevolence of the regime and the way in which it will twist the rules to always try to make itself win, they're reluctant to see that. But if you let them see it, all of a sudden you're going to bring some of those people who are quite elite and have a lot of talent to your side. They're like, oh yeah, okay, now I get it. The game really is rigged. I'm going to kind of come join you in a more kind of serious and fundamental political plan to challenge the regime. And you've put it up here kind of nicely how I phrased it in the piece. So I think that's very important. I just think there are more moves on the chessboard than Curtis thinks there are. That it's not just kind of, well, they do this and then we have to go home. And at the end of the day, I think what it comes down to is I just don't see the folks who happen to have power right now as it's very much Oz the Great and Terrible from the Wizard of Oz, the kind of weak guy behind the curtain sort of manipulating things. And, I think if we can sort of expose that fraud, there's a lot of people who can, make real political movement on our side of the fence.
Yeah, you had written up here that I had on screen just what this might be able to do, both not just as accelerationism with regards to Dobbs, but also just that the ability that this could have opportunity to radicalize others, that these voters suddenly discovered even after everything they do doesn't matter, and that the system is, to quote a former president, rigged. You mentioned the realization would lead many to reject the system entirely and could open up a new possibility for action, which I think we've seen a lot of, especially since 2020, a lot more renewed focus and discussion. Even on my end, I focus a lot more on the local and having a community and having a network where there's not just a lot of our politics is, kayfabe, or as the internet likes to say, very fake and gay. It's just,
Right.
we also have other, the cultural issues, I think, are also an area of focus where I've seen a lot of renewed emphasis on not just religious communities, but also how can we generate organizations to help locally. There's been a renewed interest in mutual aid societies. And by, again, nature of where I am in the world, and not just geographically, but politically in terms of power, that I see those to have a lot of a larger avenue, because I'm not inclined to see Cincinnatus rising over the hill and telling me to follow him. It's just something that I think we've seen a lot of, where there's been a lot of political promises for decades, which a lot more people these days, by nature of the internet and how it is now, are coming to those conclusions, like you mentioned in your article. And I am curious to see where this would go, and I would like to poke your brain on that, because you're far more connected than I am. What you've mentioned a lot about getting another bite at the apple for 24, but what direction nationally do you think things would be going in the midst of these realizations?
Well, I just think when Trump came in 2017, he was really sui generis. There was no real Trumpism. There were grifters who were kind of going to attach themselves to him opportunistically. And there were certainly people, and including me, and I was very Trump skeptical in many ways, for all the reasons that one might assume that one might be Trump skeptical in terms of his personality and his personal morality, and all these other things, and whether he was going to just cut deals with Chuck and Nancy. But I'd written in 2015, a very long piece that basically said, hey, we kind of need effectively like a Trump-like figure who's going to appeal to the following groups of disaffected people, who is effectively the groups that Trump ended up appealing to. I think the movement in our politics is over time, and I think Claremont has played a really leading role in this. And if you look at the long piece on us today in the New York Times, this really is about that: is how we became the sort of intellectual home of Trumpism. Not that there are not lively disputes within Claremont about Trump, or that we have some sort of allegiance to him as opposed to sort of our broader principles, but just that we attempted to understand Trump not just as an individual phenomenon, but as a movement appealing to a certain group of people and a certain set of interests. But I think when you look at a Blake Masters, when you look at a J.D. Vance, when you look at some of these other folks who are, coming over the horizon, Briggs in Michigan, who just beat one of the pro Meyer, who was a big pro impeachment Republican in Michigan, and he was a good guy who served with the Trump administration. There's a group of people who have coalesced around sort of a view that is just not as in thrall to the sort of corporatism or libertarianism of previous views of the right. So I think a much more, I don't want to use the word populist because it comes with a lot of baggage. And I actually think that there's a lot of dangers in us becoming too populist and getting too divorced from the reality of elite political power. And in fact, in my Elites article, I talk a little bit about this, about, the reason why J.D. Vance, who's articulating a very populist in certain ways political platform, is able to exercise power is not because he grew up in the holler, blah, 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 but because he went to Yale Law, because he worked with Peter Thiel. He has these. So it's kind of, it's a way of blending and finding a group of folks who are kind of elitely placed or have an elite talent set, but who, to use Curtis's parlance, they're the dark elves, but they have a great love for all things Hobbit, and that's their clients. Alex Kashuta is a friend of mine, and probably many of your listeners familiar with her excellent podcast. She wrote at one point effectively something that, like, kind of all politics is elite politics. The only thing that changes is the client base and the level of obligation felt to it. And I think there is something to be said for that, even though I do think that grassroots politics can also make a difference. But I think that we're sort of feeling our way in that direction. And certainly the intellectual energy among, I think, particularly the younger folks, and I can't class myself there, unfortunately, anymore. I'm very, very much middle-aged, but I think it's really bending in that direction. And I think it's going to be a very healthy place for the GOP to grow, in a place that aligns our politicians much more with our voters in a way that I think they've been out of alignment in many ways for a while, and we can explore why that is. And some of it is a legacy of the Cold War, and but I think kind of corporatism and libertarianism are going to be weakened within our coalition over time, and warmongering. And I think that that is all to the good. That's how things evolve. I mean, I was a Ron Paul guy back in 2008, speaking of kind of idealistic things that you wouldn't think. And this is an example, right? Like, nothing could have been more fringy, trust me, than being a Ron Paul guy in 2008. And yet, I was reading the piece about Blake Masters was a Ron Paul guy in 2008. I met another congressman online in that campaign, Thomas Massey, who was just like a guy in rural Kentucky at the time. There are a lot of people who were involved in that campaign. And I back up. I was not formally involved in the campaign, but I was very active as a kind of organizer and volunteer. Just as, and not because, I mean, Paul is just way too idealistic to do certain things in the rough and tumble of politics, but he was offering an alternative vision for the party that I think was really valuable. But the number of people who went on to do really, really practical stuff that was actually quite effective on the new right, who came out of that kind of weird Ron Paul world in 2007, 2008, was really significant. And in many ways, it was sort of a precursor of some of these online right communities that have kind of come up in the interim. And so I do think that to the extent that we're all just kind of organizing, or if you're a younger person today organizing in these communities and you're like, wow, I feel really remote from the centers of power. You can make a difference if you, really have ideas that you attach to plausible political forces that could pick them up, and you identify real weaknesses of the current regime that are actual weaknesses in terms of their ability to stay in power. For us, a lot in under Paul, it was our crazy foreign policy in the Middle East. That ultimately, like, we couldn't really stop it, but we could ultimately make the embrace of that a fatal weakness that Trump then was able to grab, with a more viable political campaign 7 or 8 years ago. And now we're at the point in which Liz Cheney, who is really the proxy for corporatism and kind of bellicosity within the GOP, is about to be actively defenestrated in one of the most conservative states in the United States. And if you think this is just about what she said about Trump, and that, I'm now going to confess a little bit of my own political, kind of esoteric activism behind the scenes as somebody who has gone after Cheney publicly many, many times. Her criticism of Trump was a very nice pretext for us to, but really this is about, the different types of forces that could hold sway in the GOP. And we were able to take advantage of the fact that, she had made mistakes vis-a-vis her view of Trump and how Trump should be treated, to really marginalize, I hope, over the long term, some of those views from within the GOP. So there's been a real reversal on that in 14, 15 years. And there's been a lot of spade work involved to get us from A to B. But I think it's borne fruit, and it does matter, that sort of stuff.
Well, yeah, I'm very happy to see that she's being defenestrated, no matter how many, pictures of Kevin Costner she takes. I don't think it's going to
Yeah.
work for her.
Yeah.
But no, and I think that you can't underestimate how much of the importance that the Ron Paul revolution of 2008 and especially 2012 had for a lot of young guys. Myself, I was huge into Ron Paul come 2012. I really liked him then, and that sort of was my entryway into getting into politics as a younger man, and having far more interest. And now here we are. And as I guess we hit up on the hour mark here, as we sort of talked about, the culture war, and also just our perspectives on politics. I did want to leave you with one final question, and then I'll have to get to some of the super chats that came in here real quick. Would be then, outside of perhaps just the poetry readings or the things that Yarvin is interested in, which I was very happy to see you bring up Charles Haywood's essay about sort of his refutation, which I thought is one of the best things that people should read. Would be then, outside of perhaps the aspects of the Passage Prize or poetry, which I think is absolutely important. I mean, I just had an article posted yesterday with I Am 1776. I definitely participate in it. But I think that there are other areas that we should also just be as equally as involved in. And so, from your perspective, and someone as a subject matter expert in both political activism and working in government, what would be feasible areas to be more engaged in culture war wise?
Gosh, well, I continue to think. I mean, it's a little bit of a third rail, but that's why we should touch it, because you sort of show, actually, no, it's not really a third rail. But again, the institutionalized anti-white racism of the left is a huge opportunity for us, and really pushing on that. I was talking with a friend of mine earlier today who is even deeper in practical politics than I am, and kind of talks regularly to some of these folks at the top levels. And he was expressing his frustration that, sort of all the corporates and elites have lined up on the side. If you look at the most recent amicus brief of this Supreme Court case, where, Harvard and Yale and all these institutions are saying, yeah, we should be able to continue to discriminate against particularly Asian Americans in this case, but also white people and whatever else. We could really activate some people by challenging very aggressively on that, and yet we're kind of getting wrapped around the axle on a bunch of other things. So I think that's an opportunity. I think our wide open border continues to be an opportunity, the way that we're not even pretending. People are seizing on the trans issue, but I think we cannot do it enough. Not just because, and again, the trans issue is one thing, and I've said this in some other interviews that I've done. To me as a parent, it's such a fundamental thing, and seeing this, which is going on at my kids' high school and even middle school in Montana, okay, it's such a fundamental thing, such a fundamental violation. It's so horrible what we're doing, particularly to these kids, that even if I could score 0 political points on it, but just make it go away, I would do that in a second. And I think it's sort of that, it's that much of a transgression of fundamental values that we're allowing people to do this to the kids, that we should just make the Democrats continue to defend this insanity. And we ought to be, a friend of mine said, and I think they're absolutely right, you just take some of the insanity that they're putting out there and you go on where, they can't define what a woman is, Kenaji Brown Jackson. You go on Spanish language radio and you just say, does this represent your values? Like, is this what you're about? And of course, I think for a lot of these traditional or more immigrant communities that sometimes we struggle with, they're going to be like, no. And so I think when you talk about building a broad coalition, you can do it around issues like that, which are not distractions, which are not cheap culture war things, but it's they're actually fundamental, and they kind of reveal the insanity of the values of a lot of our opponents. Ann Coulter has a wonderful piece on Willie Horton that she did years ago that I think is kind of apropos to this. And what she basically says is, she basically praises the Willie Horton campaign. And for those of you who are younger, this was George H.W. Bush, very controversially, when the media, the left-wing media controlled everything, kind of used the tale of this African-American prisoner who Michael Dukakis, his opponent, had let out on furlough and then killed somebody. And, according to his opponents, it was this kind of racial, dog whistle and all these bad things. But it was quite effective. And what Coulter was saying was, no, it was actually totally fair, because what it showed was, like, anybody who would have been insane enough to decide it was good to let a person like this out on furlough is not somebody that you should be trusting with political power in any way. And that's kind of how the trans issue is, and a few of these other issues. It's like, it's not kind of peripheral, because if you had somebody coming up to you who just like insisted that the sky was purple with green polka dots, and like, you would kind of question whether you'd really listen to them on much of anything else. And so it's these sorts of issues where the left has gone particularly insane, that even if they seem peripheral, we should actually push them, because they just say a tremendous amount about they give a broader message about that you cannot trust these folks. They don't think like you, and they are wedded to this very radical gender and other ideology.
Yeah, and I think, since we both know Spandrel, I think this is why the bio-Leninism point is very important for us to keep, because like, that's just a clear and present example of, I think, what we're dealing with.
You see this with too.
Oh yeah,
yeah. Those guys.
You do. But there were 2 super chats that came in. We'll quickly touch these, and then I guess we'll wrap it up from there. DC Perspective sends the 2, one for $4.99 US. Thank you so much. He says, "Hello, Prudentialist. How are you doing? It's a good stream so far. I hope to spend more time watching your content again. Much love." DC Perspective is working with the group American Virtue, and they're doing good work as well. And he says, again, for $1.99 US, fire Mahir, in parentheses, mission accomplished. So yeah, I mean, the primaries have not been good to the pro-impeachment crowd.
Yeah, no, and that's great. And again, that's a very useful show of force. I mean, we can debate whether or not we want to, how we feel about Trump, positive or negative, but I think that the pro-impeachment crowd was just, regardless of how you think about Trump, had taken leave of any sort of good sense politically, and it's useful for people to see that kind of kowtowing to the left doesn't pay off.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on. If there's anything that you'd like to promote or share, by all means, you have the floor.
Well, my Twitter handle is at JeremyCarl4. I am frequently censored in various ways by Twitter. So I always appreciate new followers to get out the message. My website is jeremycarl.com. I link there to a lot of my writings, which you can find in The American Mind, American Greatness, Newsweek, The American Conservative, The Federalist, sort of some of the usual suspects in our world. And I always welcome engagement on Twitter, any of these other profiles, and we just want to encourage folks to keep up the fight, because I think we ultimately can win.
Wonderful. Well, I'll be sure to add your website in the description. I have your article and your Twitter account linked below, but I will add it once we're done. But as for everyone else, thank you all so much for tuning in. I thought that this was a fantastic conversation. Jeremy, thank you so much once more. And for everyone listening and in the chat, we'll see you all around. Take care,
Thank you.
everybody.